Shabbat Shalom, everyone. When I was a kid, I watched a movie called Zelig. Have you seen it? Yes, some yeses. It's about a man who has such extreme social anxiety that he physically takes on the characteristics of anyone he talks to, like a chameleon, just to be liked. It's an absurd concept, it's extreme, and yet I relate to it, as I imagine some of us might. One time in middle school, I wore a baseball cap with the bill slightly off to the side because that's how Mac Frazier wore hats, and Mac Frazier was the coolest kid in school. And unlike Zelig, I couldn't physically grow 5 inches taller or have straight blonde hair, so instead I bought a hat, tilted it, and waited for my popularity stock to soar. It didn't, and this whole thing lasted less than a day, because immediately Mr. Becker asked me to stay after class. Ooh, I was in trouble. It was working. He just looked at me, pointed to the hat, and said, "Josh, what are you doing?" Defending my choices confidently, I said, "You're right, I look ridiculous." But nobody understands the social pressures of middle school like good teachers, and Mr. Becker was a very good teacher. What he was actually trying to tell me is that nobody gets to tell you who you are. He knew I was trying to be someone I wasn't, and he preferred the person he knew me to be. So now, the only hats I wear are kippot, tilted just so, like I'm cool. Before diving into this week's Parsha, Ve'era, which Minna taught us so poignantly and insightfully, I actually want to step back to Shemot for a second, to last week's Parsha, Torah portion. I asked my Lunch and Learn class this week, at what moment did Moses become Moses? And like always, they offered a range of magnificent answers. When he smote the Egyptian, when God called out to him from the burning bush, when he received Torah at Sinai from birth, and the debate went on. I think you can make the case that any one of these episodes is the pivotal moment of self-definition that shaped our tradition's greatest leader. But let's explore that first answer for a second. The moment he smote the Egyptian taskmaster. Another great teacher from a good deal later in my life, Rabbi Sean Fieldsmeyer, transformed the way I look at this verse. Remember, we don't get Moses' growing up. We don't know what Moses was like in middle school. Pharaoh's daughter draws this baby out of the water, raises him as her own in the palace, and then Torah jumps ahead. We read, sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. Vayifen ko vacho vayar ki ein ish vayach et hamitzri vayitzmanehu bachol. He turned this way and that way, and seeing no man, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Rabbi Fieldsmeyer says, what if it wasn't so much an external struggle between Moses and the Egyptian taskmaster, as much as it was an internal one between Moses' Egyptian identity and his burgeoning Israelite identity? She reads it this way, Vayifen ko vacho. And he turned this way and that way. This way meaning his past, his royal upbringing in Pharaoh's palace, his Egyptian self. And that way meaning his future, his true self, his Israelite identity, the person he was always meant to be. Vayar ki ein ish, and he saw that there was no man. If he tried to cling to both sides of himself, he'd be torn apart at the seams. He wouldn't be either. There would be no man. Vayach et hamitzri v'yitmanehu bachol, and he smote the Egyptian aspect of himself and buried it in the sand. I would argue that this is the moment when Moses becomes Moses. It's like his bar mitzvah, Minna, just like today we're celebrating your bat mitzvah. It's the day he declared himself an Israelite adult. But what does it mean to be a Jewish adult? If we're following Moses' example, then maybe it means to push back, literally and figuratively, at oppression, at injustice, at slavery, wherever it rears its ugly head. I'm thinking about this a lot today for 2 reasons. One, it's Martin Luther King weekend, when we celebrate a man who, like Moses, pushed back, though very intentionally, non-violently, at racial inequality, oppression, and the legacy of slavery in this country. He pushed back for justice and for this dream he had of an America not as it currently was, but as it was always meant to be. And like Moses, at the end of his life, he recounts being on the mountaintop in his eerily prophetic final speech, delivered just one day before his assassination. He writes, "I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land, and I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." I'm also thinking about Moses' pushing back at the taskmaster today because it's how he responds to the brutal captivity and suffering of his fellow Israelites. Today, we approach 100 days since October 7, 100 days of the brutal Hamas captivity, which still holds 132 of our Israeli brothers and sisters. And so we continue to push, like Moses, with all our heart, soul, and might for their safe return home, for the dismantling of the evil forces that oppress us. Because to be a Jewish adult is to see a world shrouded in darkness and respond with mitzvot, with divine light and goodness. But as we know, it's never been easy to do that. Just look at what happens next to Moses, who has just aligned himself with the downtrodden. Instead of being met with the embrace of fellow partners in holy work, his intentions and his identity are grossly misunderstood. Another Hebrew, whom he stood up for, fires back at him, "Who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" I'm approaching this Martin Luther King weekend differently than I have in the past. Because if I could zelig into anybody in the world, it would be Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who proudly marched in lockstep with his dear friend, Dr. King, and believed wholeheartedly that the African-American fight for equality in this country is inherently a Jewish fight, too. For those of us who are Jews of color, those identities are intimately connected. But for those of us who aren't, Rabbi Heschel so beautifully embodied the mitzvah in Torah to remember that we were once slaves in Egypt, and so we must never tolerate or benefit from a system that unjustly discriminates against another group of human beings. But today, this iconic picture of Heschel and King together feels distant. Since then, many Jews who have shown up at marches for women's rights and for Black lives aren't embraced as partners in this work, but are inundated with anti-Israel sentiment and increasingly more blatant anti-Semitic vitriol, are sent a clear message that we're not wanted there. Like Moses, who anticipated partnership, but was instead told by other people who he was and who he wasn't. And when our world was flipped upside down on October 7, so many of us waited for solidarity and support from our non-Jewish friends and allies. And while we are so grateful to leaders and representatives from these groups who have stood with us and continue to stand with us, many of us are sitting with feelings of betrayal, anger, and abandonment. We're whirling from a world that can't seem to make up its hypocritical mind about who we are. Jews? White people? Colonial imperialists? Genocidal? All it seems to know for sure is that it doesn't want us. So what do? Do we run away to Midian? Do we put on a hat, tilt it sideways, and pretend to be someone we're not? No. Because nobody gets to tell us who we are. Only we get to decide that. And we won't run away from the battles we need to fight in order to build a more just world. When God appears to Moses in the burning bush, God's name is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I will be who I will be. So maybe this is the moment when Moses becomes Moses. Once he realizes that he can no longer run and hide, that God has called him to be who he was always meant to be, that to be an Israelite is to stand up to Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go." This year, we celebrate Martin Luther King Day, and we commemorate 100 catastrophic days. We fight for our right to be a free people in our ancestral homeland, and we fight for an America where all its citizens have an equal and fair shot at life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We stay in the ring in spite of anyone who tells us we don't belong. It would be easy in this moment to harden our hearts like Pharaoh, as we read in Va'era this week, except for one thing. We fight Pharaoh, the Pharaoh of Hamas, the Pharaoh of racial discrimination in this country. We march with open hearts in our hands and demand, let my people go. Because that's who we've been, that's who we are, and that's who we were always meant to be. Shabbat Shalom. We continue in our Sidurim, in our red